Okay, so let's start. So everyone can hear me okay? I'm loud and clear? Yeah, okay, great. Great, so my name's Charles Levkoe. I'll be hosting this session. I'm the Canada Research Chair in Sustainable Food Systems and an Associate Professor at Lakehead University. And I'm speaking to you today from the North Shore of Lake Superior. I'm an uninvited guest on the traditional lands of the Fort William First Nation, signatory to the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850, also known as Thunder Bay, Ontario. So for me, I mean, prior to returning to academia, I have worked in a range of nonprofit organizations in Toronto, Nova Scotia, in the Middle East. I was involved in issues of sustainable food production, harvesting, access, and this work has led me to really ask some bigger questions around, in my case, why farmers and fishers and food workers that provided the very basic things we all need to survive are in fact barely surviving themselves, and why people are going hungry in a world that produces more than enough food for everyone on the planet, and especially in a place as wealthy as Canada. And now for me as an academic, my community-based relationships, or my community-based partnerships that I've built through my scholarships, are really focused on kind of pre-existing and new relationships, working with those on the front lines of struggle for social justice, for environmental justice. And the topic of this this panel that we've chosen is reflections on meaningful community campus partnerships in a post-pandemic world. And when I was asked to put together this presentation or this panel in the Seizing the Moment event, I was really reflecting on some of the realities that we're all facing right now. And the immediate thought I had of how to approach this topic was to engage with some of the people really working on the front lines of these issues. So in doing that, we decided we wanted to talk a bit about this idea, this kind of issue of recognizing, I guess, that the COVID-19 pandemic has really made visible some of the existing inequalities across societies, and that many of the realities here are not new. This is an important opportunity to consider the role that community campus partnerships might play in a post-pandemic world. So before I introduce the panel, I just want to say a few words to kind of introduce this topic. Specifically around some highlights around examples from my own area of research and action that I've been involved with over the last year and a bit. So the COVID-19 pandemic has really revealed and magnified some of the structural inequalities in our food system, namely the challenges in the dominant food supply chains and insufficiencies of social protections. And I think this goes well beyond the food system to say that when we imagine a return to normal, that it's really essential to understand that normality was already a crisis for many people, not just in Canada, but around the world. And the impact of COVID-19 has really been extremely uneven, as people that have been made vulnerable are experiencing far more significant impacts of the pandemic. For example, in the work I've been working with food and farm workers in Canada that have continued to work to keep our food supplies flowing despite major health risks, low paid and precarious workers on the front lines of crisis, facing increased health risks, which includes long-standing and unacceptable working conditions such as low pay, lack of access to sick pay and other benefits, unsafe living and working conditions, precarious employment and access to vaccinations. And we know also that good nutrition is linked to immunity, and people with pre-existing health conditions are often more likely to be hospitalized with COVID-19. And data has demonstrated very clearly that this includes a significantly disproportionate numbers of refugees, newcomers, migrant workers, and Black, Indigenous people of color. And we've heard a lot about this in the previous sessions today already. So despite, again, this sobering reality we've been talking about today, and that I'm sure many of you are also working around, I've also seen the way that many of the community campus partnerships can be really essential during a pandemic. And we already heard also a number of examples of this. But just to give one example of a partnership that I've been part of up here in Northwestern Ontario is with an organization or group called the Indigenous Food Circle, which is essentially an informal collaborative network of Indigenous-led, Indigenous-serving organizations that aim to reduce Indigenous food insecurity, increase food self-determination, and establish meaningful relationships with the settler populations through food. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, when it hit in 2020, students and faculty here at Lakehead University's Sustainable Food Systems Lab worked very closely with the Indigenous Food Circle to address immediate needs, but also to maintain this kind of broader focus on Indigenous food sovereignty. And the Indigenous Food Circle worked with its networks to provide a range of supports to First Nations, including emergency food supplies, resources, and funding. But at the same time, we really kept a focus on the idea that food-related impacts of COVID-19 pandemic on Indigenous people and determining solutions cannot be understood in isolation from some of the bigger questions of settler colonialism, capitalism, racism, and white supremacy, and a range of other kind of underlying issues. And at the foundation of this and a range of other partnership-based projects has been this kind of meaningful and authentic relationships, really rooted in truth, humility, and honesty that were built before the pandemic and don't just address immediate needs, but also have a longer term vision for social and environmental justice. So even with this and other kind of really, I think, promising partnership projects that have been active over the last year, both ones that I've been involved with, ones that I've been reading about, learning about, I think we also need to be really cognizant of the power dynamics that are present in these relationships and maintain a kind of critical eye on this, both throughout the pandemic, but especially moving forward. So when, for example, when faculty with secure jobs have access to resources, work with underfunded and under-resourced organizations, something that we've already talked about I know the first panel, but also in our regional conversation we just had in Ontario. Also challenges where despite some injections of funding during the pandemic, there's been increasing cutbacks of social services and increased kind of responsibilitization of the nonprofit sector with increased pressure on communities to do more work with less capacity. And we see this in lack of funding, lack of time, lack of energy. And at the same time, we're academics that are under the same pressures as they were prior to the pandemic to do things like teaching and service and publishing and getting grants. Even though, you know, for many of us, we have children working at home, you know, we're involved in a lot of supports in other parts of our life as well. So anyways, to get to the panel, so to help really think through, again, the promise of community campus partnerships, but also the challenges and risks that this brings, we've invited 3 individuals to join in a discussion about the ways that their collaborative teaching, research and action projects have been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, and to reflect on some of their own learnings and directions forward to build a more just and sustainable future. So we have three folks that are going to speak today, and we don't have a ton of time, so we'll do our best to get through it. And then if we do have some time for questions, you're welcome to put some questions in the chat box as we move forward. I'm going to give a very, very quick introduction to the 3 of them, and then I'll turn over the mic and they'll introduce themselves. So first we have Gaelle, who's going to speak first, who's a research assistant with the National Association of Friendship Centers, Nadine, who's an associate professor of political studies at Trent University, and who's the director at Simon Fraser University's Van City Office of Community Engagement, and the co-director of Simon Fraser University's Community Engagement Research Initiative. So Gaelle is going to speak first. So Gaelle, I'll invite you to unmute your mic. And welcome.
Thank you so much for including me in this panel and this amazing group of panelists. Although this is being done virtually, I would like to take the time to begin by acknowledging the land in which I currently reside on, which is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I'm just so grateful to have the opportunity to present with you and to be present in this territory. As mentioned, my name is Gaelle Mushyirahamwe. My pronouns are she and her, and I am the research assistant at the National Association of Friendship Centers, the NAFC, and I've been working there for almost 2 years. Just to provide a little background information on the NAFC was established in 1972 to represent at a national level the growing number of friendship centers emerging across Canada. The NAFC is a network of over 100 friendship centers across and provincial territorial associations. So PTAs from coast to coast to coast. Friendship centers are Canada's most significant urban Indigenous service delivery infrastructure and are the primary providers of culturally enhanced programs and services to urban Indigenous peoples, which includes rural and remote locations, as well as those who travel to and from urban spaces. For many Indigenous people, friendship centers are the first point of contact to obtain referrals to culturally based socioeconomic programs and services. So for the purposes of today's panel, I will be sharing a little bit of background on the NAFC's research framework and screening tool, introduce the Urban Aboriginal Knowledge Network, and share the NAFC's COVID-19 interim report. And I think by sharing these reports with you, we can kind of explore the impacts of COVID-19 on research and speak on the future of community campus partnerships. So the NAFC believes that in order to move beyond the current state of Indigenous research in Canada, a cultural shift at a systemic level in the current research environment is required. And to achieve this shift, a coordinated effort is required by all researchers, academic institutions, and those who work within research institutions that perpetuate that current culture. And these efforts must be undertaken in the spirit of reconciliation and being grounded in the willingness to change. And one of the steps to making that change is by kind of changing and recognizing that research is meant to contribute to improving the life circumstances for Indigenous peoples, including those living in urban environments. And this can be achieved by, ensuring that research is being driven by communities, using methods and knowledge systems that are reflective to Indigenous peoples themselves. And so the NAFC has committed itself to seeking that systemic and cultural change within the current research environment and has been kind of taking the necessary steps towards ensuring that the future of research is conducted and continues to be conducted in a manner that respects the rights of Indigenous peoples to self-determine in all aspects of their lives. And we had begun that work through the development of a community-driven research framework. The first steps for the development of this framework was the community engagement piece that really showcased the NAFC's commitment towards producing a research tool that is community-based and driven, and that represented the needs and wants of communities in terms of research. Some of the goals of this framework were to support and engage community-driven research, to support and build upon existing community capacity and expertise, to promote, preserve, and protect Indigenous knowledges and knowledge systems, as well as languages, cultures, and practices, just to name a few. And one of the main reasons why I, again, chose to share our framework was to also kind of take the opportunity to highlight a few of the main components of the framework, which I think aligns very well with today's topic. These components being number one, the development of this internal research policy is aimed at ensuring that the NAFC conducts and engages in research in a manner that is ethical, consistent, and respectful of the autonomy of PTAs, non-aligned friendship centers, and friendship centers. And number two, that the development of our research screening tool is aimed at guiding those who wish to partner or engage with the NAFC or any other friendship center. Sorry, lost my spot, but in research-related activities through the application process. And as the NAFC and friendship centers receive multiple requests to participate in research activities across multiple jurisdictions, this screening tool will ensure that it can prioritize its involvement in research that is directly related to the goals of the organization and will directly benefit urban Indigenous people. So for this panel, again, I believe that the main components of the research framework really align with today's discussion and kind of helps with the reflection of research during COVID-19 and what the future may look like. To build a more just and sustainable future in research, there needs to be an evident and active commitment towards building a better and just relationship. And so the framework really highlights the ways in which researchers can strengthen their relationships with communities and friendship centers. And so when looking at the context of post-COVID and the components I just listed, an example of the ways in which universities could showcase their commitment and efforts towards just and sustainable research partnerships and collaborations is to have communities lead the process of identifying research priorities and have researchers respect and acknowledge the expertise that communities and community members have to offer. And so the NEFC and Friendship Centers have been working tirelessly and endlessly towards securing funding and distributing that funding to Friendship Centers, distributing PPE, securing funding for tutors and laptops for remote learning, providing housing and kind of like isolation environments, and providing endless support to their communities. And so this work translates into communities producing responses that are determined based on community input and consultation on resources that the community needs. And it also allowed us to identify peripheral needs, needs that may not have been outside of the scope of research topics, but come up as a result of direct community engagement. So in the urban indigenous context, community engagement allows us to remove a colonial and patriarchal approach to research, which enables us to convert culturally appropriate research into meaningful programs and supports that directly benefit our communities. This provides agency to our communities through demonstrating how they can impact change for themselves, their families, and future generations. The NAFC was able to release a COVID-19 interim report, which summarized and provided an overview on Friendship Center Movement's response to COVID-19 and the support they continue to provide to their community. This report consisted of personal accounts from community members and Friendship Center staff on their experiences with COVID-19 and the effort placed to ensure the safety of their community. As this data was collected in-house, and the report can truly encapsulate the essential role that Friendship Centers played during this pandemic. This report can be seen as an embodiment of how research can contribute to the betterment of lives of urban indigenous communities, as the research and data is rooted in urban indigenous communities for urban indigenous communities, which is really supporting the idea of nothing about us without us. And so spaces like the Urban Aboriginal Network, the Urban Aboriginal Knowledge Network, the UAKN, kind of cultivate a space of empowerment for urban indigenous communities, as they are the true leaders of these research projects, and they can see themselves in the research that is being produced. And so, established in 2007 and co-led by the NEFC and CERNAC, the UAKN has commanded community-driven research, knowledge mobilization, the administration and development of research networks and grant processes, the knowledge of local community structures. And so the UAKN is a community-driven research network which focuses on urban indigenous concerns. And the goal of this network is to kind of contribute to the better quality of life for indigenous peoples living in cities and towns by filling the current knowledge gaps in urban indigenous research, programming, and public policy. And just to make a long story short, essentially, I think that at the end of the day, it is really important to remember that communities often use and view community-driven research as an opportunity to share and communicate their experiences and realities and histories in a ways that matters and makes sense to them. And so once researchers and universities understand that, that can be seen as a step taken in the right direction to having a stronger community campus engagement and relationship. Another step for building a more just and sustainable future would be the revisioning of the power dynamics within community campus partnerships. It's not just about, their participation and engagement of communities, but providing a space for communities to exercise agency. And so this pandemic will and continues to aspire years worth of research projects, which will require the participation of communities because they are the real experts. And this means identifying approaches to building relationships with communities, such as urban indigenous communities, to establish trust and a sense of longevity that encourages community participation in a meaningful and respectful way. So that was my spiel. Thank you so much.
Gaelle, thank you so much. for sharing all that. If you have any links you want to you could put in the chat box as well to some of those documents. That would be really fantastic to be able to take a look at them. Thanks. And I'm going to pass over to Nadine. And again, if folks do have questions, I'm not sure we'll have time to get to all the questions or any questions, but if you do have questions, we can try to respond to some of them in the chat box as well. So Nadine.
Okay, thanks, Charles, and thanks for inviting me to be sharing on this panel. I am zooming in from the traditional territory of the Michi-Saagiig, Anishinaabe, Chippewas, covered by the Williams Treaties. I am at Trent University in Political Studies and the Trent Center for Aging and Society, located in Peterborough, Nogojiwanong. So I will share 4 experiences and issues. Really first is that in-person research partnerships, especially with communities with experience of marginalization, is irreplaceable. And I also do research within arts and culture. Arts and culture gatherings, live arts and cultural gatherings are irreplaceable. And the two together form an importantly diverse and whole ecology within a city like Peterborough. Nonetheless, even though the in-person research is irreplaceable, my community research is stalled or postponed for the moment, and nonetheless, I continue to build relationships and new areas of knowledge mobilization. I think the third experience I want to share is that as a researcher, I do feel continued pressure to publish scholarly publications. In fact, I think it remains the same. And I think that there has been intensification at post-secondary institutions. And then fourth, I'd like to see pressure and influence for our public post-secondary institutions to contribute engaged research capacity for the public good. So to re-emphasize the public in public post-secondary institutions. So back to my first experience, my in-person research titled Aging Vitalities with Bodies in Translation has been stalled until research partnerships can start in person. It's been stalled partly because I'll be embarking on 2 new projects. The first project I was invited by Curve Lake First Nation to facilitate short filmmaking made by Anishinaabe elders to create short films. And these stories will be very significant for this First Nation community for the intergenerational knowledge from the past, present, and into the future. The second project will bring together disability identified Anishinaabe and settler persons to imagine ways of welcoming and creating access for Indigenous and settler disabled persons to in-person arts presentations such as an art exhibit or a theater performance. And this is important because for this project, it will create meaningful dialogue and enactments of access as well as justice to the arts of disabled persons, access to the arts in the city on the part of disability identified audience, especially of Anishinaabe, and also to have meaningful discussions of reconciliation between Indigenous and settler disabled persons. So even while the research is on the back burner, I am focusing on what I can do. And so I continue to build relationships and new areas of knowledge mobilization. So during last summer, I was able to connect with Anishinaabe and settler elders from the Aging Vitalities project to create podcasts on how they have been impacted during COVID. So I wanted to get experiences from the grassroots. And what I've been learning and what has been shared is the toll associated with the absence of physical touch and just how important human touch is to individual and collective well-being. There's also the difficulty in navigating the journey of changes in life, a life partner's health, as well as one's own health. There is the ongoing adaptation to long-term care home crises. And just also the loss of physical proximity and closeness with relations, which extend beyond the still dominant understandings of the nuclear family. So I'm on to my third experience. As I mentioned, I'm sure I'm not alone, where researchers feel pressure to scholarly publish. It remains the same, and it has intensified at post-secondary institutions. And so I think that there is a need for researchers to collectivize and to send clear and strong messages to their departmental committees that assess and manage tenure and promotion applications, for example, strong and clear communication among faculty, perhaps through the faculty associations at post-secondary institutions, to send these messages to the dean, as well as to the institutional level tenure and promotion committees, to acknowledge and to recognize these research disruptions because of the public health crisis, and especially for disproportionately impacted researchers that include women, racialized, disabled researchers, and also, of course, engaged research, which which is well known to often take longer to reach scholarly publication. And then a question that I have been asking myself is, what are our post-secondary institutions doing to support our local communities and our frontline community organizations? One, I guess I'll speak at the provincial level. There is an entity called the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario. So I'm speaking of my Ontario context. It's AKA HECO. So it started in 2005, and it basically evaluates the post-secondary sector and provides policy recommendations. So one example I want to give is that HECO focuses also on the labor market, especially the private sector. And I think that HECO could deserve more scrutiny, or perhaps more talkback from perhaps organizations like CCEC. So in the 2020 budget, the Ontario government committed $60 million toward what it calls a micro-credential strategy for employment-related upskilling. So if you think, well, what's a micro-credential? These are just starting to circulate within my own university. People aren't really sure what they mean, except that there's a lot of money to support them. But micro-credentials refer to, it's a very broad definition, skills, knowledges, and attributes. And it can come from courses that are already taken, or through the development of new courses. And there's some questions around the development of new courses for these micro-credentials, because they don't appear to require the same kind of peer assessment or communication or transparency or approval through, let's say, a university senate. And so these micro-credentials are oriented toward the private sector, but they can also be oriented toward the nonprofit sector. And at the same time, I think I want to broaden the perspective here in that I think pressure needs to be brought to HECO to meaningfully include outcomes of post-secondary education to the nonprofit sector, as well as to a more complex view of access, accountability, and quality within and for our democratic society, and just and sustainable enactments and endeavors. So I think that HECO needs to be told to orient post-secondary institution accountability in ways that enact just and sustainable communities, not narrowly for post-secondary institutions to prepare students to be primarily employer ready. I think we also need citizen ready and citizen engaged students and graduates. So I'll end there. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Nadine. It was a perfect bridge between what Gaelle talked about and some of the real community-based stuff and some of the tensions within the university as well, and all through your own experiences. I think will also kind of help bring us along that narrative as well, or that train of discussion. Because also occupies a place both within the university and as a community partner as well. So are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Thanks. Thanks, Charles, Gaelle, and Nadine for starting off this conversation. I'm here on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples, and I'm in the middle of moving and all of this stuff, but it's wonderful to be in conversation with all of you. What I was going to share was that I think even from the relatively privileged site of higher education, of universities, that I feel like we're still in a kind of state of collective trauma. And this sense that when we get back to some idea of normal, it's not the world that we left before the pandemic began, as Charles, Gaelle, and Nadine mentioned. These were inequalities that pre-existed the institution. And we're walking into a context that also has heightened political mobilizations, people calling for a sense of urgency and justice, and where our systems, public systems at universities, but also broader ones, have stood in the way of these changes. And this question of what's the role of the post-secondary institution to situate itself along these lines, because we are, as we are going through a sense of collective trauma, we do need that joy, love, durability, a place for the arts to be centered in how we might imagine that world to be. I'm situated in the inner city of Vancouver. I've been working out of the art school at SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement in a highly gentrifying context in a neighborhood that has multiple effects and social processes underway, and also at the site of 312 Main Street, which is a formulated old police station that has now been co-located with dozens of community organizations. And as the pandemic hit, being located here brought up some very, very clear problematics. One, how information came to the neighborhood related to the pandemic in terms of public health information. It began very slowly, and now we're in a context where we have some level of herd immunity within the downtown East Side neighborhood because of the way that public health agency did respond eventually in a positive way, although it started off very slowly. There were contexts here where the Vancouver Foundation, one of the larger local foundations, partnered with the United Way, the local credit union, Vancity, and university partners as well, to set up a rapid response fund to get money into civil society organizations that were doing frontline work on the ground, and seeing how quickly, relatively in 2-3 weeks, that there was applications coming in and money going out the door to relatively grassroots projects, that these systems that were, seemingly intractable, they had, quarterly sessions, all of a sudden could be turned on a dime. And so there's really amazing learning that happened in those short timeframes. On the other hand, there were all of these kind of moments where the kind of objectivity of public health gets questioned, because oftentimes, even within the realm of public health, it can replicate the inequality that exists in our societies. And in places, suburbs like Surrey, where we had multi-generational families, a much more working class community, and also multilingual contexts where information wasn't being translated into different communities, that we had real challenges in the way the media framed the pandemic, also had racist overtones, quite frankly. And so the importance of the institution, both in terms of the sharing and dissemination of information, but also in playing a critical framework when society gets mobilized in the way it has in a pandemic context, there's a kind of rallying around a particular narrative, and public health plays a really, really important role to get a centralized message out, but it also is sometimes distorted with political implications. And having people who do work like epidemiology and other forms of mathematical modeling that are working with communities to be able to go out into the public sphere to sometimes question the government, those types of things that a university does well is vitally important. To be located at 312 Main Street, where my next door neighbors are an urban indigenous organization like Alive in the building. The Downtown Eastside Women's Center has an operating office there as well. That in the day-to-day of just being in proximity with community organizations, being in the actual space itself, it allows a kind of information flow that can be really mutually beneficial in terms of future research projects as a site of grad students to be building those partnerships in terms of actually knowing what's happening quickly on the ground. I think in as much as the pandemic disrupted research projects or questions around getting through ethics offices in a time of physical distancing got in the way of the work, it also created really, really important conversations inside these institutions about, like, can we look at this in a different way? Can we figure out a way to do ethics that's not administrative, but can actually be part of a broader conversation? For anyone doing community engaged research work, this is central to how they work, and traditional models of how ethics is looked at, which is to stop universities from being sued, oftentimes is the framework that's being put forward, is that if we can flip that in a way that's beneficial for communities and for researchers, we can have a greater public impact. So I think really, really important conversations have come forward as a result of really important pressing needs on the ground that were held up by processes at the university. So these questions of systems change are, I think, inevitably going to come to the forefront. I think all of the questions that people bring up around justice, equity, decolonization, inclusion are fundamental, and they're not going away. And the important role that we have to create a space inside the institution to uplift the voices that are on the margins and the periphery. At the relatively privileged site of universities, we play the important role of mediation. And some of the things that Gaelle and Nadine and Charles brought up as well is that we need to kind of think about peer review in a much more complicated model, particularly for university researchers and others that are doing that work. Can we come up with forms of peer review that include community participation? Can we have this valued in the same way as people go through their tenure review process? We have incredible people doing fascinating forms of research that are producing research that is circulating in the community, but they are still being measured on a journal impact factor and all of those pieces. And so to me, I think that this question of what is going to be possible in that arena is vitally important to bring up the value of what a public institution can be. I'll put in some links to a podcast below the radar that we've started out of our office, and we have wonderful colleagues like Hannah McGregor who are looking at podcasting as a form of scholarship that has peer review built in with publishers as well. I'll stop right there just so we can get to some questions, but thank you all for being here.
Fantastic. Thanks. I've heard Nadine, I know, but and Gaelle I've heard speak only through on YouTube videos. So it's great to have you both, or you all together, even though we're on Zoom together. I want to actually, we do have about 7 minutes for questions. So I want to throw out a question to start that I'm just thinking about as I've been listening to you all talk, and I've also been thinking about as we move through the day, and that is how we kind of come to terms with the tensions, or let's say tensions or potential opportunities between transformative goals and systems change that we're talking about, that I think many partnerships really espouse to become. But also at the same time, the bureaucracy of the institutions that we work for that really tend to the status quo, right? Whether those be universities, nonprofits, the foundations that fund us. So I wonder if any of you can speak a bit more. I know you've all kind of spoken to that, but say a bit more about those tensions and more opportunities, and specifically in this moment. And you really mentioned, this is a moment, right, that has, these are not your words, but that have concealed and revealed some of the best and worst of our society. So yeah, I don't know if I can throw that back at you as just something about, these tensions between our goals of transformation and the kind of bureaucracy and status quo nature of many of our institutions.
I can just jump in really quickly with a couple of points, and hopefully Gaelle and Nadine can jump in. Those of us who come from community organizing work into the institution, we noticed right away what are kind of the slow, dumb, clumsy processes that get in the way of the work. On the one hand, the university calls for a sense of porousness. How do we bring communities inside of our spaces? We want to be open and transparent to the public. Yet when I'm trying to pay a community partner through our processes, the amount of forms that have to be filled out, like all of the barriers that get put in front of you, and you're caught up in this sort of interstitial zone of doing the workaround, trying to figure out the way around the policy where you're not quite breaking it enough that you don't get into trouble so that the thing can happen. So we all have our kind of parallel systems that we have to function through. And I think it's important that we bring them up and make it transparent so the university does actually change, because the amount of time that all of us probably are spending in the administrative zone of work rather than doing the actual work, I think unfortunately gets in the way of the work.
I can go next briefly. Thanks, well, Charles, just as you said that it is a very slow turning kind of institution, post-secondary institutions, I'm thinking that it is working through the processes is also a slow, and there's a real labor. I'm thinking, for example, with Gaelle's presentation, the documents that Gaelle mentioned, I think they would be great documents, for example, to include with research ethics applications, to educate research ethics boards who may still be resistant to community engaged or co-led kinds of projects. And I'm thinking also through scholarly publication itself in terms of co-authoring with community partners. That slowly changes what authorship and research partnership means within scholarly publication, which is still considered, as mentioned, given higher priority. And I think that the health crisis, because of the workload increases experienced by faculty in terms of research and teaching and service, faculty associations, in my experience, have been more engaged, like more meeting more often. And so there's opportunities to attempt to, for example, create messages around tenure and promotion from the faculty association level. It's not easy still, but at least the conversations are happening. Thanks. End of thoughts.
I think just to add in, or kind of like echo what Am said so eloquently, whereas I was just going to use the term loopholes. There are so many loopholes in these, policies and so forth that can really create space for communities to step up and to, for example, be co-authors and to have direct access to funding to research projects, for example. It's just a matter of sharing those loopholes with communities and partnering with them from jump. And I think also with these tensions, it's just a matter of, acknowledging it head on. I think that a lot of times when addressing it, it's with this quote of, but we're still trying to do better without really going head on with the issue, because we all know it's there. It's always going to be that elephant in the room. It's just a matter of tackling it on and, again, acknowledging that the loopholes exist and that there is space to make space for communities. It exists, and there's a way to do it without getting, quote unquote, in trouble. So I think those are the steps that we can work towards exposing and sharing. So end of thoughts here as well.
Great, thanks so much for your thoughts on that. We have like 1 minute left, and there was a question Diane had in the chat box around how do we sustain the positive changes that you're seeing. I don't know if everyone wants, if anyone wants just 20 seconds to maybe throw out an answer to that or a thought about that. How do we sustain the positive changes that you are seeing?
I could go first. I think it's by continuously putting in that effort, but also not being okay with just what's currently going on and always elevating the effort. You know, I think that we can end up being very comfortable and being in this treading thinly on these lines of just, you know, showcasing the progress without really working and expanding on it. So I think if there's a continuous effort on the, for example, academic institutions and researchers, then I think that will kind of continue to encourage community members to engage and kind of cultivate that trust, and also showcase that longevity in these relationships and these amazing changes. So that's my thoughts.
I can just jump in really quickly. I'm currently teaching in the semester in dialogue. My colleague Diane Finegood is here from SFU as well. It's a small cohort-based program, and seeing these students who are in their early 20s, you know, what they really value in the relationship to the university is having those positive, affirmative examples that they can be inspired by. And I think alongside the hard questions that we have society, we have a real duty to inspire and motivate and construct a different type of affirmative future because we're walking into a tough world with intractable things. And when you throw in climate change to a pandemic, there's a lot of negativity being sent towards people who are in the early stages of finishing their degrees, and making sure they have the proper armature ready to take on the world in a way that will be constructed in a durable way is absolutely essential. And to me, it's really inspiring being around them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what I hear from Gaelle and I think the edges that we're living in and with and through and on, bringing these into as many spaces where we are active and are engaged, whether it be research, teaching, and service, and to our broader communities, I think keeps the conversations and the discussions alive, and then extends the imaginary potential that much more. Thank you.
Nadine, Gaelle, thank you so much. We only went like 3 minutes overtime, which is amazing. I really wish we could all go for a walk at least here it's beautiful sunshine, and continue this conversation. But hopefully we will another time. So we are going to take, I think, now a 13-minute break. The Magda has just put the workshop program in the chat box, and I think when we come back at 4 o'clock Eastern time, then we are going into our regional breakout group.